and welcome to the Hibernation podcast. My name is Dahyo Lloyd, and I'm inviting you to join me for a weekly conversation with some of the amazing artists who've decided to stream with us over the course of this festival. Before we start the show today, we'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the custodians of the land upon which we stand. Wherever we are in this country, Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded, and we must be mindful that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As we share and explore music throughout the festival, we are also on a site that carries the reverberations of many centuries of music and cultural making. Joining us this week is Adam Melzer. Adam is a Sydney-based academic and sonic artist. His works have been featured at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, the Australian Computer Music Conference, the Audio Mostly Conference, the Hibernation Festival, and in some playlists curated by Making Waves. Of late, he has become interested in composing collage music. Say hello to all the lovely people, Adam.
Oh, hi. Thank you for having me, Dahyo. It's really nice to be here.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
Look, not bad. I mean, lockdown is lockdown, right? But,
Yeah. It's always a bit.
University's just come back. I've got some really amazing teachers this semester. But other than that, just been organizing a lot of streams, doing this sort of stuff. What have you been up to?
Oh, I'm prepping for the Hibernation stream that I'm going to do next week, and getting back into teaching at university, which is, for the context, Dahyo's in my AP class.
Yes, it's the highlight of my week, AP2. So you're new to tutoring this year.
Yeah.
How's that experience been for you?
Oh, look, I'm really enjoying it. I'm really enjoying it. I think the what I really love about it is the fact that everyone who is there at the con, are there for a reason, and they're really engaged and they want to learn. So from that point of view, from student feedback, it's really nice, and being able to work with the students as well is great. I think on that level, where we're all sort of encouraging each other and we're all trying to improve, including myself and my own teaching as well. And I think from that point of view, it's been really great. And also just being able to, talk about some of these concepts, like going right from listening all the way through to perception. It's really fun. I really enjoy teaching that class.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just even more generally, I'm fairly sure you can probably relate to this, but sort of growing up and going to high school is that sort of nerdy kid who's interested in music, especially as someone who ends up doing composition. It's quite nice when you go to the con and suddenly everyone there is interested in music, like not necessarily composition, but some aspect of it,
Yeah, it's a good environment to be around. I mean, I think that at least when I went through as well, and went through my bachelor's degree, the thing that I noticed was, you're all kind of learning from each other all the way through, and it's because you're all equally passionate. But I think really for me, it's about having those sort of collaborative opportunities and be able to work things out with people and be able to talk through musical solutions or musical problems or just music in general. I think is something that is truly abundant at the con, but in a really good way.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're doing your PhD now, correct? And you finished your undergraduate 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think it's 2 years ago. I would have finished it around. Yeah, it would have been around 2 years ago. I think so. Yeah.
Do you want to have a quick talk about that sort of journey that I think a lot of us go through as composition students at the con? Where I think we've discussed this before, but when you sort of you go to the con and you're like, I'm going to be a film composer, and then you sort of get taken to the dark side through Damian's classes for me,
yeah, exactly,
and that sort of stuff. How's that experience for you?
Oh, look, for me, I think it stems a bit further back from me to the con. To be honest, I think it stems back quite far because you know, if I must admit, for me, orchestral music and even jazz music was almost like a second and third love. And then, you know, film composition, because, you know, you grow up watching all these films, you know, you that sort of is floating around in the background. And of course, the big thing is before you enter the con, they say, oh, you know, you hear from certain people like, oh, you know, if you manage to make it in the film world, you set yourself up well and all that sort of thing. And you know, I find that initially I was quite on the fence about it, but you know, by the time you're in year 12, you're looking towards your future, you're looking towards all that sort of stuff. You know, that does seem attractive until, at least for me, when I started composing that way, and it didn't really feel as as organic, and it felt a bit forced, you know, when you're writing that sort of in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I think that's just an individual response. You know, some people love it, and I mean, all power to them.
Oh, you mean film music in general?
Film music in general,
Yeah.
but less the actual film music, but writing film music, I think. And so when I got into the con, you know, and I'm suddenly in first year, you're bombarded with all this sort of, you know, I think the first lesson we looked at Bartok. I hadn't even heard of Bartok before I went to the con. And you know, and then he had people like, you know, Stravinsky, who I had heard of, but you know, you have all that sort of music thrown at you, and you're analyzing it really deep, and then suddenly you realize just how much you can gain from that music, and how much it how enriched it is, and what you can sort of take from it and learn from it. And I think for me, it's the act of sort of researching that music that I found the most rewarding, because it's because it has so many different layers and so many things happening on so many different levels. There's always something that you can find, and that really, I think, as I went through, I think that really appealed to me. Of course, the other thing though is you know, in the background of all of this, for me, I mean, going back to when I was really young, you know, I grew up on the Police, Bowie, Queen, you know, all that sort of stuff, and very different from the art music sort of scene that I was finding myself in now. But I think I've always had a genuine interest in pop and rock songs as well. Not to necessarily pursue as a career, once again, because as I said, you know, I find researching into other sorts of styles of music interesting. But I've always enjoyed that, having that in the background, and I think it's because, you know, you learn so much about harmony and the way sort of, you know, verse, chorus, verse, and the sort of standard structure and all that sort of thing. But I think more than anything else, the thing that attracted to me to that music was production, which I hadn't really explored until the con. About, I think, second year, I heard an album called Motion Graphics by Motion Graphics, which is just an insanely good piece of vaporwave, or album of vaporwave, and it really.
I mean, vaporwave is just generally fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. You know, can't go wrong.
I'd say it's a guilty pleasure, but I don't even feel guilty about it. It's just good music.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, that really hooked me into the sound stuff, and then you know, exploring more electroacoustic works like the stuff by Daniel Blinkhorn, which is just insanely good, and you know, hearing and looking into that stuff, and you see that it has, in my mind, that music has so much depth and so much intricacy, and so, you know, to be able to compose like that is just amazing. So from there I was hooked on electroacoustic music. So I kind of had just this weird path where I sort of tried out a whole bunch of things, and then suddenly one day I listened to something, and then I found Daniel, and from there it was like, you know, I listened to Motion Graphics, and then it got me interested, and then I found Daniel, and then, you know, it kind of went from there. Because of that, you know, I think the electroacoustic scene was a nice way of me taking that production urges, but also that necessary level of depth that I kind of wanted to sort of learn from as well. And so it kind of went from there.
And Daniel correct me if I'm wrong, but Daniel is your PhD supervisor at the
Yep,
moment.
yep, yeah.
So that's actually a perfect fit, isn't it?
Oh yeah, look, I mean, I love working with Daniel. He's just such a lovely man, and he always has so many useful things to say. Um, yeah.
Also, his music is sublime. It's just
Oh,
beautiful
yeah.
stuff.
I mean, Anton
Um,
Zoa and Red Sound, they're just insanely good pieces. And I think I've been really lucky, to meet someone like Daniel, but also for him to be so encouraging. I couldn't ask for a better supervisor, I think.
well, that's definitely a good thing.
Yeah.
Um, would you say that? I mean, this is a really boring question that every composer gets asked, but would you say that Daniel will be one of your bigger influences in terms of what you write?
Um, I think Daniel has definitely, yeah. I think one of the most useful things that, particularly because he also took me for third and fourth year of my honors, my bachelor's degree in honors, and I think uh, one of the most useful things that in those sessions was I actually got to watch him compose, and you learn so much by watching someone compose, and you
Mm.
can't help but just not take not take actively take notes, but sort of like go, okay, he's done this, that's kind of interesting, what if I did this on my own work, and so that influence just naturally stemmed into you, I think. uh,
Yeah, I'd say especially because you had him for 2 years in your undergraduate. Now you've got him in your
mm,
postgraduate, and it means you develop some sort of deep working relationship with
mm,
someone whose work you really admire, and I think that's really valuable.
yeah.
It's like just that experience of sitting with someone who has who's an incredibly talented composer, but also just has years of experience in doing this stuff and observing their process. I think it's very enlightening. It's a
mm,
very useful sort of tool, and you can learn a lot more from that sometimes, even than if they're just telling you things. It's just by watching people. I think you can learn a lot.
yeah, exactly, yeah, because you get an understanding of their process, I think. Now I'm not by which I mean, like, I'm not interested necessarily in a process composition. I'm just interested in um, how they get a musical result and the process to do that. And um, I think that you know, learning how someone shapes material and watching how they kind of put their own stamp on the work kind of then goes, that gives you ideas as well. Um,
Mm.
I kind of feel it's the same thing when you're with a friend. Like, I work with Liam Mulligan a lot. And every time that we work together, we have, I think we both grow and we both learn from each other and what each other's doing. Um, and, it's so I think it happens in numerous levels. I mean, you've got that supervisor relationship that I have, but then you also have, you have that relationship as well um, with the people who you're going through the degree with, and what they're doing and how that sort of influences you as well. Um, yeah, I think there's just different levels of influence that sort of happen. There's more personal influence, and then there's more professional influence, and it kind of just works its way that way.
Well, I guess that's also an advantage, isn't it? There's a like with being involved in this sort of community of artists who are doing strange things or just exploring their own different ideas in
Mm.
depth, and just talking to some of these people and spending time with these people. It really informs your own ideas and thoughts about the way you should be writing.
Yeah,
I don't know if you agree
yeah,
with
no,
that, but
definitely, definitely.
that's definitely been experienced for me.
Yeah, I definitely like. Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because I think half the fun of what we do, and particularly half the fun of the Hibernation Festival in general, I think, is the capacity to explore ideas, and the freedom to be able to do that in a in an environment where, well, you got from the, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Hibernation Festival sounds like it's set up for those lo-fi experiences, those experiences where it's kind of off the cuff, you're trying something out, and I think those are the most critical ones, because without those, you kind of it's very hard then to distill an idea down and take it into something else that you're doing, you know. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think the really nice thing that Damian and Liam set up with Hibernation last year, and I'm really happy to be included in this year's planning for it. And one thing that I really love about Hibernation and about a lot of aspects of this community in general. I mean, I think that there's definitely there's an it's okay to fail sort of attitude in terms of these performances, and I think it's really interesting for me for a number of reasons. It's first off, if you do say, oh, it's okay to fail, then that takes a lot of pressure off in terms of certain technical aspects of things, like especially because, well, it started last year and everyone was just learning how to use the technology, the live streaming stuff. People were sort of learning that for the first time. But so it took some of the pressure off that, and it freed people up to be a little bit more inventive with what they were sort of planning on doing with the whole live stream experiments thing. And for me, I remember a lot of the streams that I really liked the most last year were things like Liam's response streams.
Yeah, they were fun.
Where it really it's not necessarily like, he was playing sound through his iPhone speaker. It's not going to be incredible quality, but it was a really fantastic way of interacting and bringing this sort of music closer to people than I think you would see in, well, you've done this, when you book out a concert hall at the con, a recital hall or something, and you put on a thing and everyone is sort of going through the program notes throughout the piece, and then they sort of clap politely at the end.
I really hate program notes, but that's a sorry, that's a completely different story. You finished that.
Well, I mean, what I was going to say is I feel like if people are reading the program notes during my piece, I feel like I failed as a composer.
Yeah.
Because program notes are sometimes there as a crutch to get you through a really boring piece of music.
Well,
I don't want to get cancelled for that, but like...
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I read a piece of research. I can't remember who it's by, but I'm sure if you typed it into Google Scholar, it would come up. But basically, they found that people who read program notes before they played a piece, actually, it detracted from their enjoyment of the piece. And so that's why probably, during the piece, they're reading the program note, because they form their expectation, I think, when they read the program note. It's like, this is what it's going to be. And really, I 100% agree with you. I think it really should be, the music should speak for itself. And, people can then put their own interpretation onto it if they would like, but instead of prescribing an interpretation for them,
Well, tell me if you disagree here, but I feel like sometimes we take what we do a little bit too seriously. It's like, the music has to be super, I mean, these are a bunch of words I hate, but really deep and sort of, it's got to mean something, and it's got to be it's got to be more than just a piece of music. And I think that's, I don't like that. I mean, it could be good, but I think sometimes we get too caught up in what the music means, and then we sort of, it detracts from our enjoyment of it, because we feel like if we don't get it, in quotes, then we have failed as an audience. And I think that's sometimes not a very good sort of attitude to have.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head with a lot of, at least in my view, there are a lot of problems that I have with musical criticism, particularly in the pop and rock sphere. When you see an album that's lauded, it's got 99, right, on Metacritic or something like that. And you're like, well, you expect also to like it, but you may not, and I think that comes down once again to musical preference, but also I do think that at some point we need to draw the line between music and experience a bit, because there's something that I would definitely say is more geared towards giving you that sort of, like, how would I describe it? Well, something that's meant to be listened to versus something that's meant to be sort of digested and thought about, and or something along those lines. And I think there is a time and place for both, but the issue is in the criticism at the moment is there's not really a consensus on where that line is. And so when people listen to music these days, they think, oh, they want it to be an experience, as opposed to just listening to the music. I mean, there's so many great albums out there, don't get me wrong, but there's just a couple which you feel like, at least from my personal point of view, when I listen to it, and listen to it on the level of the experience, I'm like, oh my God, this is great. But then I listen to it on the level of compositional craft, and I think, actually, there isn't that much in it. It's kind of been held up by certain things that are meant to heighten the experience. Maybe that'll be a reverb or something, a production choice that make it feel like it's suddenly you've gone from this like small musical idea of 4 chords into this cavernous epic thing, but it may not be more sophisticated. It's like I think it's kind of a bit hazy, and there needs to be some work, particularly in music criticism, about identifying where that line is, figuring out what kind of bracket it's going into, and because of that, giving it positive feedbacks based on that, as opposed to saying, for example, this 2-chord song is great because it really swells the heartstrings. I do have a problem with that. You sort of see what I'm talking about? Is that?
I do, and I am inclined to agree with you. The thing is, Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich is, for me, one of the most sublime pieces of music I've ever heard. And I mean, harmonically, it's so simple. So I would hesitate with sort of, and I don't know if you're doing this, but I would hesitate personally before equating sort of good compositional craft with harmonic complexity.
Oh, no, I don't mean it like that. I don't mean it like that. I do mean it because sometimes the most simple of ideas can be amazing. What I do mean is that I think because I think well, let's put it this way, okay? I think there is maybe I shouldn't say music versus experience. Maybe I should say something like compositional craft versus production, because often the experience comes from production and the way, or arrangement, or the way it's put together, and sort of not the way it's put together, but the way it's kind of like articulated versus the way it's put together. And I think that oftentimes the way it's put together is sacrificed to make the way it's articulated better. That's what I'm sort of talking about.
Yeah, so, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I've always viewed, I mean, maybe not necessarily things like mixing, but as someone who is primarily an electroacoustic composer, I know you can relate to that. I have always viewed the sort of production as part of the compositional process. Would you say it's separate?
Look, that's opening up a whole can of worms. It depends on what is it? I don't even know.
Can of worms, I think.
Yeah, I was like,
it's a completely different box of frogs.
Yeah. Yeah. God, if you had a kettle of worms, that's not good at all. Anyway, sorry. I think it depends. I think it depends who you're aiming your music to, because if you're doing something like an acousmatic style, right? Mm-hmm. You're dealing with raw materials, you're dealing with a production-based medium, you're dealing with something like spectrum morphology, which it sounds evolving.
Can we just define acousmatic music for those?
So it's sound, basically when the sources of a sound are unseen. Okay, so it's often dealing with very abstract sort of, musical material, and how it sort of evolves that musical material from like a very small sort of gem. So you might have something like an object, and you can kind of go into the object and all its features, physical features, and kind of extrapolate more material from it, and then sort of arrange material like that. But that's very production based. There is craft there, but it's very production based. And so I think there's a good synergy in that. But when you compare that to, I'm going to go back to pop and rock because I think it's an easy one. Pop and rock stems from a tradition, harmonic tradition, and that began, I'd probably say it was sort of jazz blues sort of thing, and sort of inflected it a bit with, and also a couple of inflections from contemporary classical stuff these days. But I think there's in that case there's the actual the way the song is put together, and you could play that on acoustic instruments, but then it's heightened by producers, and that's what their job is. They've got to go in. These days they see there might be a piano part, and they might decide, okay, well, I want that with a synth, I want that with a filter, and there you go. And it's sort of like I wouldn't say that's really synergetic. I'd say there's two sort of forces that are blending together.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I guess when you're talking about pop and rock, or you know, not even just that, but a lot of sort of contemporary music, you think about. I guess you can more easily distinguish the two phases. You've got I can't speak for everyone who's written pop music, and I guess the few times when I've written pop music, it's been a different style. But I guess you can say that there's the phase where you sit down at a piano or something with a sheet of a sheet of manuscript and a pencil, and you figure out what the chords are and how the melody goes and what the lyrics are, and you write it down. And there's that, and then there's the bit where you put it into the computer and you use your samples and you. So I guess is that what you're getting at? This is the sort of two.
Yeah.
The two stages.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting then that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we're both involved in writing music, that those two stages definitely, that line is not as clear.
Yeah, I'd say that definitely. Yeah, which is why I think it does depend on what sort of music you're writing in some ways. Yep. And that's also, that links back into the point about musical criticism, though, and the experience versus the craft and the way it's put together and the production. I mean, to me, one of the problems with musical criticism is that there's a lot of people who are very specialized in, well, how would I put it? There's classical, musical criticism, and they're very much orchestral works, but they're not they criticize, works with orchestra and tape, but they don't necessarily, or you may have someone who's very much interested in a music critic who's very much interested in well, I'll go back to rock, but 70s rock music or something like that, but now they're doing rap, and rap is a very different way of thinking compared to 70s rock. So I think there's a lot of problems that need to be sorted out, and maybe the key is to have more critics who are specialized in certain things, so that then they can draw that line between craft, experience, and be able to tell, okay, that one's more experience because what I'm aligned with here, if I'm talking about electroacoustic music, I'm talking about there's this sort of synergetic sort of thing. So that line is sort of a bit blurry. It doesn't really exist. So really, I've got to take it as the way that the sound materials evolve, how they sort of go into each other, and that at that point, you can dissect the work from there. But if I'm a classical composer, I'm a classical composer and a classical critic, and suddenly I'm being given this piece of this piece of jazz music, I'm going to have a very different interpretation, and I might say, the craft is lacking because it relies on 7 chords, and so this is, but it's kind of like, well, then you're kind of missing, it's kind of like some of the point, because you're not really defining that line because you haven't been brought up in that tradition, and therefore you don't have the knowledge to define that line. I think it's a very nuanced sort of I think it's a very nuanced sort of discussion that needs to be had, and yeah, I don't know. I think that at the moment we just sort of, when someone hands out something into the world, they expect one or two things. One will be either it's praised, or the other one will be it fails, because there's a lot of people out there with very brought up in certain traditions with very but who kind of cross between all different forms of criticism to all different forms and genres of music. And because of that, at least what I see these days is you see people giving stuff 90 or something like that. I'm just going to go to Metacritic, but you see something of someone giving a piece 90, but then you look at what they reviewed and you see that they've been reviewing a whole bunch of different stuff. And so it feels very weird that then they can judge, they've been viewing a completely different genre of music. And so it feels very weird then they go to this piece and say, oh, this is great. But then you also see, for every 90 that you see, you'll see like a 50 or a 40, and it'll be the same case. I don't know.
It's very hard to. I mean, I think criticism, music criticism, as it appears in magazines and things, I'm always slightly skeptical. Skeptical. I can't speak. Skeptical of it because, I mean, it's just like when you're talking about what is 1 + 1, there is a clear answer. But I mean, aesthetics is such a subjective thing. We haven't got to the point where we can agree on certain things enough to, I think, give an objective opinion on if it's good or not. Like, what is good mean?
I know exactly. But
I mean, like, we're struggling to bloody define what music is. I'm yet to come up with a description of music that I'm satisfied with. Probably the closest is organized sound, what John Cage said. But I mean, like, you can probably find exceptions to that, and that is so vague that, I mean, is this podcast, we're both recording it and I'm going to organize it and it's sound. Is this podcast music? I would probably say no. But
it used to be so easy, didn't it? Oh, it has a melody. Okay, well, it's music,
Yeah. Don't go Ben Shapiro on that. I'll cry.
Look, I think we're at the point where that's going to be increasingly harder to find. We're at the point where people have their own individual. Music is composition is becoming increasingly individual. My point is just, I think the criticism needs to reflect that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic that composition is becoming more individual, though.
I think it's 100%. I think it's great. I just think that.
Yeah.
Because look, I mean, the romantic era of music is a great era of music. I really enjoy the romantic era of music, but I think the late 1890s and the early 1900s, thank God there was an explosion of,
I think the early 20th century is an incredible time for music.
Oh yeah. Can't go past Screaming at all.
There's just poem of ecstasy.
No.
But I mean, I think one thing that I really love about this idea of sort of quote unquote new music and all this sort of stuff is you'll go to a new music performance and you won't necessarily like it, but I think if you're involved in creating and thinking about new music, if you go to one of these performances or if you watch a Hibernation stream or something, you won't necessarily like it, but I think I always end up thinking about music afterwards, and I think that's really something valuable. Whereas I'll go to a performance of Beethoven Pastoral Symphony or something, which is obviously a fantastic piece of music. I don't pretend to be a better composer than Beethoven.
I don't think anyone
but
would.
No.
No, yeah.
But I'll go to that and I won't be asking questions afterwards. I'll just be like, oh, that was a good performance. I enjoyed the second movement, sort of stuff, and that's valid too. But it's not as exciting to me.
Well, it depends what you're looking for, That's the subjective audience thing coming in there as well. If I go into a piece of music, if I went into art music thinking, oh yeah, I'm really in for I'm really looking forward for some, good old harmony. I really love my 5/1s. You're really letting yourself in with the wrong expectation,
Yeah.
But then again, if there might be a day that I go to that same art music concert and I'm like, well, today I want to hear a piece of music that's going to challenge me. Yeah. And I think that brings up another interesting point in a lot of ways, and something that I think will be interesting to see as music becomes more individualized. Is there's at the moment we're in that small field of art music. We all go into it trying to look for new ideas. It may be a piece of music that we may not necessarily like, but we can go, okay, well, that was good, and really and I really enjoyed that little bit, and so I can learn from that, etc., etc., and you go from there. But I think it's interesting the disparity between the way that we hear things and the way that a general populace hears things. And I think that part of it, I mean, we spend years, training ourselves to listen in certain ways and getting cultured in certain things. And that's, our socio-cultural conditioning come into play. But then the general populace as socio-cultural conditioning coming into play is probably limited to a certain extent. Probably I'd say about, by the time you get to about the same sort of chord structures in sort of early jazz music, which are now used again in pop rock and rap and all that sort of stuff. And I think that there's just that sort of, it's like at this point, as music is becoming more individualized and people are exploring very traditionalist sort of stuff and also very out there sort of stuff, and something like Bandcamp's great for that. And as people go more to that, will people feel more of an openness towards sound? And I think, or a general populace feel more of an openness towards sound. And I think that will be very interesting to see, because if they do, it could mean that we're on for, almost like a singularity event in composition, whereby
I'm down for that.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think we have to admit that it's quite a privileged position to be in, where we can, we can study something like composition and we can really get into something like that we love and do that, put a lot of time into this. Some people obviously can't, which is very sad. Because I think everyone should be listening to Val and all this sort of weird stuff. But I think, we talked about the early 20th century being a fantastic time for music. I mean, a bit early to say, but I am hoping that in 100 years people will be saying the early 21st century was a fantastic time for music. Yeah. There's some pieces that have been written by composers who are alive and who are working, that are just absolutely sublime pieces of music. Yep. I mean, probably what comes to mind for me is Damian Barbler on the piece of violin, Ball of Wool.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
I said that just floored me. Yeah, shout out to Damian.
It's really good. Go check it out.
Damian, if you're listening. But no, it's a fantastic piece of music, and it's really great. I mean, selfishly, I was like, yeah, I'll do this podcast because it lets me talk to people in Australia, mostly in Australia, who are actively creating music that they love, they care about. And that's really nice to me to be sort of engaged with these sort of people. And I think also the other thing, tell me what you think about this, but the other thing that I think has been really fantastic for music has been computers. Partly because music is more accessible, information about music is more accessible, but also the tools, the sort of compositional tools that computers give to composers these days, I think are really incredible, and we don't think about it enough. I mean, I always talk about it, but I think, for example, MaxMSP, and I mean, if you talk to me for 5 minutes, I'm a massive MaxMSP nerd, but I think that is just really amazing because it's like a blank canvas that you can create anything in, and it could be music, it can't be. I mean, the first thing I learned to do in MaxMSP was I made an egg timer. But I think, it's like it's so good because it's like you can make it a tool to do, most, if you need something very specific for one piece of music, MaxMSP, you can just make it. Yep. Do you use Max much in your compositions?
Yeah, well, look, my journey with Max has been on and off. We have a love-hate relationship.
I understand that.
I think the best thing about Max is exactly what you say. I 100% agree. You know, having that blank canvas, and if you know in there, you go in there, you know what you're doing, and suddenly you can create this just like amazing thing that you never thought you would ever have access to, or never thought, you know, or something. Actually, the best thing I think about, actually, sorry, the thing I think that is better than that is when you make a happy accident. You know what I mean? When you stuff up a bit of coding, and then you realize, actually, that's kind of cool, you know, and then that feeds into your idea, and you've got that sort of feedback loop almost with Max in your process and figuring it out that way. So
are you saying the sort of learning curve of Max
I mean,
is
it's
almost the worst part and also the best part?
Yeah, because there can be days where you can be like, oh no, what have I done? You know, like, but then there's also days where, you know, you make that mistake, but that mistake is so good because you've let's say you were going to route something from a signal into a wave or something, but you decided to put that a wave object, but you decided to put that instead into a resonator object that you've got automated, and then but you did it by accident. You were trying to put it into the wave object, and then suddenly you realize, oh wait, oh that's cool, you know, and then it kind of feeds into your compositional process and into your patch, you know. I think that's one of my favorite things. And also one of my least favorite things about Max. But
yes, because sometimes it can be incredibly frustrating when you can't figure out why your code doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to sit there for hours debugging it.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when you have this huge messy thing, and then you're like, oh, you know,
spaghetti code. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm terrible with Well, I used to be terrible. I'm not so bad now, but the first time I was using Max, I never routed patch codes. And so I go back to some of my old Max patches now, and you just see all these, like, it's just everywhere. It's just everywhere. And so I go back through them now, and I just, like, root patch chord.
Well, it's funny because, I mean, I taught myself Max because just due to sort of timetable clashes and all that stuff, I wasn't able to take the Max class that they have at the university. So I just taught myself, and I was looking at some of those early patches that I was making, and I realized that I went through about, I'd say, over a year of learning and writing music with Max. And I didn't know what the trigger object was.
Yeah.
And so, you know, obviously because Max reads things right to left, so I was getting events that were triggered in the wrong order. I didn't realize this was happening, and I was like, why is it making this sound? But that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So I guess that's somewhat of an example of what you're talking about with happy accidents in Max.
Yeah.
You using it much in your own pieces these days?
I mean, I was using it for a bit for my PhD, and I was kind of using it as kind of like a hacking thing. Whether that will expand out, or whether I will think of something different, it depends. I'm kind of in a point since we last spoke. I'm kind of in a point where it's like I've got a result that I'm happy with on Max. How do I get it further? Would Max be the best software for that? I think that's the big question actually with Max, because I think you're right. It's a blank canvas, and you can create some awesome stuff with it.
Sometimes that can be terrifying.
Sometimes that can be, yeah. And I think you know, the platforms like Cubase or Logic or something like that, the thing that they offer you is immediacy. And while you may not be able to get the precise exact thing that you're thinking of in your head, you may be able to get something very close in less time if you know. So
yeah, and I mean, I used to be such a Max purist. I used to just want to do everything in Max, but I mean, the for example, the reverbs in Live is so much better than the reverbs that I can make in Max.
Yeah.
Maybe that's my skill level in Max. I don't know, but I mean, you know, for certain things, I'm not going to do my mixing in Max.
No.
For example.
Yeah, no, that's a nightmare.
So it's like, yeah, it does have its practical limitations.
I mean, every software does. I think the thing is it depends. It depends how you're going to use Max as well. I think whether you want to make a composition in it, or whether you want to make a tool which will then help you further to make composition. See, I think I'm at the point where I'm considering what I've made in Max maybe a tool to help, or maybe like an idea generator. And I'm wondering if I can turn that into a composition stuff in Max, or whether I should think of it as an idea generator to then inspire what I do in something like Logic. And
I mean, I can't condone the use of Logic, but I know what you mean.
yeah. Look, Logic Logic's automation is terrible.
No, Logic is fine. I'm just being a purist.
Well, look, I mean, at least I didn't say Pro Tools. Pro Tools is...
I would go with Tools over
really?
Logic, to be honest.
Look, I don't know. I mean, I use Pro Tools a couple of the issue with Pro Tools is you're not really getting much bang for your buck. You know, that's the issue with Pro Tools. And any MIDI stuff would be awful. If you're recording stuff, fine. You know, I would go
I've only ever used Tools for recording and mixing, so
yeah, fair.
You know. I guess, like, because I started off such a Max purist, I went the live route, and I think a large part of that is because of Max for Live, because it's like a nice little individual thing. And Logic is honestly fine. I'm just shit stirring, but
no, that's fair. I mean, the weird thing for me is I hear everyone talking amazing things about Ableton, but I've only used Ableton once, and I didn't really get my head around it. You know, like Max, but maybe that's because I didn't have much time with it. But like Max, it took me a while. It took me quite some time. I'm not really a mathematically oriented brain. It took me quite some time. But I think I got eventually I got to a point where I had sort of a basic sort of understanding, and then from there it sort of managed to, that learning curve, the main part was over, and then from there you're just sort of consistently learning, and you sort of, you know, but you know how to put things together, and you got your basic set and all that sort of stuff, and then you're basically good to go. But I feel like with Ableton, to me it was just there's something about the set out. I think it was the looping sort of aspect,
the session view,
the session
side of it,
and how it sort of prioritizes that sort of that looping, because I know it was made for live applications, and it's to me it's weird. See, what I like about Logic, as much as I understand it has so many flaws, what I do like about Logic is the fact that I can I know it's very easy, like intuitively laid out, so it's very easy for me to go in knowing, okay, this is what I want to achieve. And as I said, you know, I may not achieve that exact result, but I may achieve something that's like 99.9% of the way there.
With 99.9% less effort, you know. I mean, I think I've had the stock plugins for Logic are really good too, but I think the more interesting sort of discussion here is just software in general.
Yeah.
And how useful software is as a tool. I mean, you know, it's bloody expensive, but it's really, I mean, look, I apologize to Ben Carey and any other hardware people who are listening, but I really love software. I mean, I think software is just and that's such a nerdy thing to say, but I think software is just such a useful tool for so many different applications. And I mean, yeah, you know, you get people and you get people who'll talk about like, you know, you'll buy if you go and you buy some classic mixing tools, you know, there's compressors that you can get for $20,000, or you can buy an emulation of that compressor, like a digital emulation of that compressor for $200. I mean, like that, you know, that's still a lot of money to spend on a plugin, but $200 versus what, $20,000. And if we're being completely honest, how much can you really tell the difference? Like,
well, look, I think there's probably some people who would disagree with you there.
Yes, that is definitely a contentious.
But well, I mean, in fairness, I've been spreading out contentious viewpoints all night. So you know, during the party now.
That's what we're about.
But yeah, well, yeah. What was I going to say? No. I think the software is catching up. I think that's what I think. I think you can we're still, you know, there's still a difference. But I do think that the software will be there within the next 10 years.
And it's democratizing music because it just makes music production and electroacoustic composition so much easier now than it was 10 years ago, you know, let alone like, you know, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But not to say that I'm not interested in hardware. I
Oh,
am. But
hardware has it. I think hardware is its own beast, and
yes,
if you go, I have no idea about hardware. I'm not gonna lie. Hardware is over me, but but I have a really great respect for noise composers who can go in, take out, with they might have a broken toy or something like that, and they can
you
just.
should check out Oscar Sawyer's stream, which is happening next
Okay,
Sunday.
well, I'll
He's
definitely
doing
check
he's
that.
doing circuit
I'll
bending.
definitely check out. I'll
I'm
definitely.
very excited. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Mm,
I think with some of that hardware stuff, especially the really lo-fi stuff where you're hacking things like software, like circuit bending. I mean, it gives you that potential for happy accidents like you get
yeah,
with Max. Uh,
yeah. I think so. But also I think there's you're inspired by the sound as you hear it. To me, that sort of thing is very performative. Um,
mm,
and it's always going to have that edge and kind of more improvisatory, unless you go in and then you sort of record it, sculpt the materials from there. That at that point, then it sort of becomes a combination of composition, improvisation, and performative stuff to me. But I always find that like there is a virtuosity of that. That
yeah,
we obviously
absolutely.
it's always seemed really weird to me that when people talk about virtuosity in technology, the first thing that they go to is the turntable, and I mean, great, I like the turntable, but that's been around for a while now, and there's so many different things. I mean, even
Have you heard of
laptops.
this guy? Have you heard of this guy called Author and Punisher?
No, I haven't. No.
No. I mean, I think he's really fascinating because he's like a one man, I think, sort of drone metal
Mm,
guy. He does these live performances, and it's all the sound is software. So he uses, I think it's live, and he controls them with these MIDI devices. But the really interesting thing about him is the MIDI devices that he uses. He builds himself. I think he's an engineer and he's got access to this equipment, but he builds these huge MIDI devices. I mean, like he'll build a knob that is like the size of a plate,
mm,
or he'll build these massive triggers that he uses, like massive levers and things, these huge heavy ones made of metal that he uses to trigger sort of certain musical events, and it's that added sort of visual aspect and the physicality of moving something that's so heavy that it really gives this sort of feeling of weight to his music, and I think just
mm.
that physical aspect is a really fascinating thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think yeah, it's always nice when a composer goes into that sort of stuff. I think. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time. We have talked for
Oh,
quite a while, but I would like to ask, your stream is next week on Wednesday.
yes, it is. Yes. Uh,
Yes, I would like to ask, what are you planning on doing? Can you give us a bit of
I'm gonna.
a sneak peek?
Yeah. Okay. We're gonna be watching my dog. Um,
I'm sold.
no,
I'm sold.
no. It's what I in terms of the music sort of stuff. That's the visual. But the thing is, it's kind of like I've set it up as almost like a surveillance cam almost. And the sounds that you're going to be hearing are from electromagnetic fields. And so it kind of you get this like synergy because the surveillance cam will change depending on what happens in the electromagnetic field. But I've got these really I'm very excited. I've got these microphones that basically allow me to hack into these electromagnetic fields and hear the radiation that's been emitted, and
Very
it's
scientific.
it's it's fantastic though. It's so fun because you find things that you've never heard before.
So we're talking about hardware. That is a really, I think, interesting use of manipulating
Yeah,
hardware.
yeah. Well, there's uh yeah, there's a bunch of composers, particularly in Europe, and sound artists who have been exploring this sort of stuff. But normally they do it in two ways. So I can't remember her name. But she did this. If it comes back to me, I'll say it. But she did this sort of sound installation whereby she had this whole city, and she same sort of thing, because you could do the same sort of thing by rewiring headphones. And so she just gave headphones to members of the public, and she called it Hidden Sound. And basically, they walked around the city, yeah, I really should remember her name. She was the pioneer of all this sort of stuff. But she
it'll come to you.
Yeah, it will come to me eventually. Like without that sort of stuff, she kind of liberated that sort of field, and then sort of a lot of people got interested in electromagnetic field recording. And only sort of recently they've kind of been making smaller versions of it so that you can sort of go and just take specific objects and stuff. And I mean, it's found its way into film sound design as well, I think, by now.
So this is a new thing for you?
For me, yes. For me, it's a new thing. I think I found these sorts of works probably sometime last year, so pretty recent. And I've always kind of been curious because I really love it. It's kind of like, the way I think about it, it's almost like having natural glitch music.
Yeah.
And it makes it fun.
That sells it to me pretty well, to be honest, man. Are you... So is this going to be the first performance you've done?
With this sort of thing?
With this sort of technology?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
That's exciting. I mean, that's perfect for Hibernation, right? The live stream experiments.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I hope it goes okay, but you know, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be fun. I've been experimenting around over the last week, and the amount of stuff that I've realized that comes from a phone, you know, is just insane. And yeah, it's weird because if you've ever had a CD player, you've had a CD player, right? Yeah.
Yes,
yeah. Cool. There's some people who I know who I haven't ever had a CD player. I think that's so weird. But anyway, if you've ever had a CD player, it's the sound that you sort of get if you lean right into it and you listen not to the sound that's being emitted from the stereo, but the sound that's being emitted from the disc and the way it's sort of whirring. That's the electromagnetic sort of field that's being emitted. And it's nice to have something where that can sort of be unearthed and presented at the forefront.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Dahyo. It'll be fun.
No worries, man. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We have been talking for 57 minutes now, which is actually more than I was expecting. But I think you know, I never shut up, and if I'm having a conversation that's interesting, I don't really want to stop it. You know,
that's right. I never.
So Adam's stream is next Friday. This coming Friday, even August the 20th at 8 p.m. So definitely tune into that. Also, check out the Hibernation website to see the other amazing artists who are streaming this coming week. So thank you for being with us, Adam.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to you. And to those of you listening, thank you very much for tuning in to the Hibernation podcast. Get vaccinated if you can, wear a mask, stay home, and stay safe.